Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's author talk. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any and all questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer all questions within the time we have allotted. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel at a later date. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. Just a quick reminder, we'll be drawing a winner for the giveaway at the end of the talk. And I will now turn it over to our moderator for tonight, a member of the Board of the Friends of the Library, Mary Weiss.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Good evening and welcome to this virtual author talk with two critically acclaimed and award-winning authors, Kristin Harmel and Sadeqa Johnson, to discuss their recently released novels. My name is Mary Weiss. I am a member of the board of the Friends of the Westerly Library of Wilcox Park. The Friends are collaborating with the library tonight in bringing you this virtual event. Good evening, Kristen and Sadeqa.
Good evening.
Thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you.
This is an unusual format, for at least for me, with having two authors discussing two different books, their own books. Typically, we have one author and one book. However, Kristen suggested, and we readily agreed, to invite Sadeqa to join us in discussing this statement: why telling stories of the past can help change our perspective on the future. However, before addressing this statement, I think it would be helpful to provide the context of these two historical novels. There are stories of singular women in quite different times and places confronting overwhelming circumstances to survive. Now, I'm going to try to do one question to each and back and forth. So I hope it doesn't get too boring, but I want to be fair to each of you so that you have time to answer these questions. Both of you have very interesting book covers and telling titles about your books that offer us some hints. Now, I'm always trying to be very careful not to give out any story spoilers while I ask any questions. So just stop me if I do that. Kristen, your cover depicts the back of a woman. I'm going to hold it up here so our audience can see it. In a worn red winter coat and scarf, looking outward with two vintage airplanes in the sky and a forest in front of her. I know that there is a specific scene in your book that addresses the red coat. How did this cover come about and what is it telling us?
Well, that is a great question, Mary, and thank you so much for having us. I think we're both really excited and happy to be here. So the Forest of Vanishing Stars, the woman on the cover is a woman named Yona, who was kidnapped from her German parents on her second birthday and raised deep in the wilderness by the woman who kidnapped her, with virtually no human contact, but all of these survival skills. And so as the story unfolds, the kidnapper dies, Yona's in her early 20s, and her path crosses with that of a family of fleeing Jewish refugees. This is 1942, it's Eastern Europe, and it's based very distinctly on the real life stories of refugees who fled into the forests of Eastern Europe and survived the war that way. So that's kind of what the cover's speaking to, that World War II vibe, that forest vibe, all of that. But I will tell you, the interesting thing about the cover is that the red coat on the cover came before the red coat in the book. So, you know, they ask you for a cover brief and, you know, saying kind of how you visualize the cover. And as always, I suggested something that sounded like a beautiful cover to me, which was forest and stars, essentially. And they came back with this. So every single time I've done that, suggested what I think it should look like, they come back with something that's 100 times better, as this was 100 times better. This completely captures the book. The cover designer, whose name is Chelsea McGuckin, is a genius. I love her. She's done my last 4 or 5 covers. But my question when I saw this, because I loved it, was, why on earth is she wearing a red coat while hiding in the forest? Like, that doesn't make any sense. But yet it did make sense, and I had to figure out a way to explain it because we all loved the cover. And it wound up being that we explained it in a very logical way, which was very accurate for the time period. a lot of the clothing that the refugees wore in the forests, a lot of the food they had in the forest, a lot of the weapons they had in the forests were taken from villages around the forest. So when they needed something, they would sneak in and steal something from a farmhouse or, or whatever they could get to and get out of safely. And so the coat that she's wearing actually was stolen during some time that she spent in a village near the forest. And thus a cover that matches the actual content of the book. Although I will tell you that this was almost exactly what they sent me as a mock-up, except the coat was fancier. This scarf was actually a fur stole, which would have made no sense. And her hair was lighter. So those were the three things that had to change, but we made it work.
Well, I know in reading the book, there's a little bit more to the story too with the red coat. So I'm glad that you saved part of that for our audience. Sadeqa has this wonderful cover. It shows a Black woman in a yellow 19th century gown. Just like Kristen's female figure, though, her face is not shown. She appears poised and waiting. Is it significant that her face is not visible?
For me, I always feel like not having a face on the cover leaves the reader to be able to imagine whoever she imagines or he imagines. So I always like to leave the face off if I can, the back of the head, the side profile, but to just leave it to the reader's imagination. And I actually sent a red dress as my cover, but Kristen got the red coat. I didn't get the red dress. But all of the red dresses they sent back, we see the cover as one thing as we're writing the book, but that's not really our expertise, not really, right? Like we're the writers, and so we're not the art directors. And so even though I'm very grateful that they ask for our opinions, I'm glad that they come up with something even better. And the red dress, I thought, fit with the story because there's a scene where the cover of the book, Yellow Wife, the main character, her name is Phoebe Dolores Brown. And there's a scene where her mother is marching off in a red dress. And I thought, oh, that would be beautiful on the cover. And it just was not working. And so they continued to work. They came with the yellow dress. We made a few changes. I asked to add the sewing machine in the corner because she's a seamstress. There's a key that I asked to add because the diary in the book also has a lot of significance. And then if you look in her dress, you see the city of Richmond kind of in the 1800s. And I thought because the story takes place in Richmond 1850s, that would just give the book a little bit more depth. But for the most part, I can't really take too much credit. Our art department is amazing and they really did the book cover justice.
Well, I think also there's a message that you're conveying. I think you've covered some of that, but the city of Richmond is very important. The yellow is a very significant color. And if I could just jump to what does the title of your book mean, Sadeqa, The Yellow Wife? I was not familiar with that term until I read your book.
So Yellow Wife is the story of Phoebe Dolores Brown. She is the mulatto daughter of the master of the plantation, along with his favorite slave, Ruth. And so she is mixed race. She has been promised freedom on her 18th birthday. It's something she has always known. Her father has promised to free her. But a series of events take place. The master takes a wife. And instead of this wonderful life that Phoebe Dolores Brown envisions for herself and that her mother has promised her, she finds herself thrust into the bowels of slavery, where she ends up at the Lapeer jail, which is a punishing center and holding site for enslaved people. There she catches the eye of the owner, who is the jailer, who wants to make her mistress of his jail and also wants to make her wants to make her his woman. So she has to outwit him in many ways and sacrifice for not only herself, but those who she cares for. And the term Yellow Wife actually came from, the story is loosely based or inspired by Mary Lumpkin, Robert Lumpkin, and the Lumpkins jail, which is an actual point of history in Richmond. And I found a point of his will, Robert Lumpkin's will. And he said, I leave all of my property and my real estate and my fortune to my yellow wife. And he was referring to Mary Lumpkin because she was very light-skinned. And then he left some things to his Black concubine, who was very dark-skinned. And so that was the way he addressed his property. And when I read that, I thought, wow, Yellow Wife would really sum the story up very well. And so that was the title that I chose.
I think we'll get to that a little bit more later on too. Kristen, the title of your book, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, seems to have more than one meaning. I mean, I started counting up different things that I thought it could mean. Perhaps you could share some of those meanings without telling, any spoilers about your book.
Well, I will tell you something funny. I feel like every answer I'm going to give you is like, actually, that wasn't how I envisioned it. But my initial title for this book was The Dove of the Dark Forest, because Yona, the main character, has, well, first of all, her name, which she is renamed by the woman who takes her, means dove in Hebrew. And she is named that because she has a birthmark in the shape of a dove on her left wrist. And so I thought that title had many layers of meaning. I liked the alliteration. I liked the idea that doves mean peace. I loved the idea that doves can kind of take flight and, look down and from above it all, sort of all of these layers. But they felt like that sounded like a young adult novel. So back to the drawing board we went. And that was right. I don't think it was the right title for the book. So The Forest of Vanishing Stars, I think, has a lot of meaning, a lot of different meanings. And a couple of them include one, as the characters disappear deep into the forest, the deeper they go, the more the canopy of trees overhead blocks out the sky. And so as they go deeper, they talk about how it is a forest of vanishing stars because, they're in the center of the forest and they can no longer see the stars. Like in the leafiest part of the season, the stars are blocked. But another element of it, sort of a double meaning, is there's a point in the novel where the characters are actively trying to escape the Germans. And they talk about the stars overhead. And one of them pats the place where his star used to be, the star that marked him as Jewish, the mark that the Germans made him wear. And he says, may we all be vanishing stars, like after they talk about how the stars are vanishing. So it did kind of have a few levels of meaning. And it ended up being a better title than Dove of the Dark Forest.
Well, it certainly is an adult title, but the idea of the darkness of the forest too, I think Yona found great comfort in that. So when the stars would leave her, she would feel more calm and more at home, particularly in her loneliness, at least in the early parts of the novel.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, this is a real simplistic thing, but I just wanted to understand. Some authors title their chapters, some list them numerically. Now, Kristen, you've chosen to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and Sadeqa has given us little hints about what's going on in each chapter. So, Kristen, why did you choose the numeric style?
That's what I've been doing for probably 15 years now. I'm not good at chapter titles. As you can see, I couldn't even come up with the correct title for my own book. So titles apparently are not my forte. My very first novel, which came out all the way back in 2006, had chapter titles. And that was one of the hardest parts of the book for me, coming up with the chapter titles. Like the actual writing of the book was fine. The actual plotting was fine. The titles were difficult. I think since then, I might have done chapter titles for my second book. I can't recall. But it just makes more sense to me personally, the way I write, that the chapter titles don't have to mark what's happening. Like it's just this chapter follows that chapter. And that's kind of the rhythm I've gotten used to. But I have great respect for people like Sadeqa who can come up with brilliant chapter titles because that's a skill I don't possess.
Well, we had an author recently who was writing about an actress, and her titles were all about different movies, but these were movies from the 30s and 40s. So I was constantly Googling, well, what's this movie and what's this one about? And then trying to relate it to the chapter. But Sadeqa, you've done an excellent job of this. You give us hints about what's going on. So I started writing a table of contents to myself and saying, oh my goodness, this is the outline of the journey that our Phoebe is taking. So did you think about doing a table of contents or not, or say, hey, I don't want to do that?
The first time I thought about it is when you suggested it. So it never crossed my mind that a table of contents would be helpful. I think I always think of table of contents with nonfiction books. So it was not anything I considered. I will say that Yellow Wife is my fourth novel, and every single novel I have written, they all have chapter headings. It's just the way I started as a writer. It feels right to me. Also, it makes it almost, as I'm writing, it feel like a short story, so to speak. And so if I know what the chapter heading is, I know the points I need to hit in that particular chapter. So it's just part of the process for me. And when I can't think of a chapter heading, I know something is wrong. So I have to, yeah. So that also helps me to kind of identify what's not happening in this chapter that I can't sum it up with a couple of words.
So Sadeqa, do you write the chapter headings before you write the chapter then?
I write the chapter, then I come up with a heading, and then
Okay.
everything has to mesh as I'm drafting it. But as I'm
Ooh,
drafting, if it doesn't mesh, I know something is wrong.
I love that. How cool.
Mhm. It really centers you in your writing.
Yeah.
That's excellent,
Yeah.
excellent. Well, that was just something I was curious about. So thank you for answering my question. And one of my authors one time said, "Oh, you can't write a chapter that's longer, X number of pages, because people can't read for longer than that these days. The attention span is short." And I didn't like that either. So I'm glad you each have different approaches. It's great. The female protagonists in your books live about 100 years apart in very different geographies and parts of the world. As Kristen has said, Yona is in war-torn Europe, escaping Nazis in the dense forests of Eastern Europe, and Phoebe is enslaved in pre-war Civil War Virginia. However, these stories are so similar as each of these women confronts unspeakable cruelty and physical deprivation while experiencing love, which was quite a juxtaposition, I thought. So, Kristen, in The Forest of Vanishing Stars, just a minor point, but I noticed it's a departure from your earlier World War II books, of which there have been several, the last being Book of Lost Names, when you were in France. And now all of a sudden you're in Eastern Europe. How did you get from France? I mean, you could board a train, I guess, and get to Eastern Europe to change your locale.
Well, yes, my number one advice based on that experience would be don't do that right before a worldwide pandemic begins. And you have to write the entire book during a worldwide pandemic when you're totally comfortable in France and now you're in Eastern Poland. Um, I will speak to that in a minute, but I just wanted to speak to your previous point about how our books have these similarities. Because I think that is an important point to make. And I don't think I've said this to Sadeqa before, but, we were talking before we came on today about, you asked if Sadeqa and I were friends in real life. And we said yes, but we've actually never met in person. But I feel like I know her. And I feel, we've done a couple of events together. We've, talked by email. But I think our novels have such a similar heart to them. And I found that with other authors too, that if you really are drawn to somebody's book and it has a similar heart to what you're writing or what you're feeling, like there's just sort of this instant connection. Like I just know we're the same, we're like very similar people at our core. You know what I mean? I can just tell that from what we're writing about. And I love that. I love that that we can be writing about such different subject matter, such different time periods, and there can be such a connection between the books and between the message, sort of. But sorry,
Oh,
Mary, I got off. I got
No,
off
no,
track.
that's fine. That's fine. I'm
You-
glad I
you-
sparked that.
yes.
but you were asking about what prompted the move to Eastern Europe, and it's kind of no answer and also a big answer. So the no answer part is I have gotten very comfortable writing about France. I lived in France for a little while. I've written several World War II novels set in France. The one I'm working on now is another World War II novel set in France. That's something I love to do. It's something I'm very comfortable doing. I know a lot about that history. I wanted to stretch. I wanted to stretch. I wanted to spread my wings a little. I wanted to see what I was capable of. And so moving somewhere different was a challenge, and writing about a forest was a challenge because I'm not a particularly outdoorsy person. I love the outdoors from the air-conditioned comfort of the indoors. No, I mean I love taking hikes and things like that, but I'm not somebody who you could plunk down in the wilderness and I would immediately know how to survive. So researching that and not only researching the how to, but the emotional toll of what that would have felt like a stretch for me. And I wanted to stretch with this book. So that was a part of it. But another part, honestly, is that this story just spoke to me from the moment I came across it. These real life stories of these refugees. As soon as I knew that's what I wanted to write about, Yona and the woman who kidnaps her, Yerusha, just came to me almost completely whole, and it just felt like it arrived in this package wrapped in a bow that also required, 6 months of research, but aside from
Yeah.
that, a bow. But I was midway through writing this book when I discovered that my dad's side of the family, which my dad is 3/4 Jewish. I was raised Catholic. My mom is Catholic, but my dad's side of the family is 3/4 Jewish. And I found out midway through writing this book that the Jewish members of my dad's family, who actually brought our family name over, the Harmels, came from an area of Poland not that far away from what I was writing about. And what's interesting is that part of this story is about identity. How much of you is something that's in your blood all along? How much of you is what you're raised to be? How much of you is the choices you make, right? Like that's something that Yona really struggles with throughout this book. And I don't have good answers to that, but I will say it was not until I was midway through writing this that I really began to wonder if some element of this story had been in my blood all along. So that's, yeah.
I think
Interesting.
so. I have to just jump in and say, I think so. I definitely feel that you were called to write that story. Like I could feel it happening on the page. And it wasn't until I got to your author's note that I got that you had that family connection, but you found out later. But it definitely felt like there was a calling there. Like the characters
you.
just leapt off the page for me, for sure.
I cannot tell you how much that means to me. Thank you so much for saying that.
Mhm.
I feel that way about your book too. Thank you.
Well, Sadeqa, you made a change with your latest book, The Yellow Wife. And was this your first foray into historical fiction?
It absolutely was. And I have to say that it was a terrifying leap of faith. It really was. I had discovered the story of Mary Lumpkins by accident. I was just on a hike, so to speak, with my friends and family. We were walking the Richmond Slave Trail, and the story was on a marker. There's 17 markers on the Richmond Slave Trail, and one marker was dedicated to the Lumpkins jail, Mary Lumpkin and Robert Lumpkin. And when I read the marker, I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. And it literally gave me the chills. And it felt in that moment like it was something happening to my body. We skipped ahead on the trail and we went to the African burial ground. And I could feel the ancestors sort of ministering to me. It felt like a calling. It felt like they were waiting for me and they wanted me to tell their story. But because I had only written contemporary fiction before, I was like, what, why did you choose me? All the writers in Richmond, and I'm not even from Richmond. I'm originally from Philadelphia. Like, why did you choose me? But I had to say yes to it because it was so strong. And when I did, I was glad I did because it's such a period of history that I've always been drawn to. I've always wanted to know about slavery and what it was like for our ancestors and what happened. Like, how is this? Like, what happened? So I was always reading those books, but I never thought that it was something that I would eventually write. So when the story landed in my lap, very much the way Kristen explains it, like it just finds you. Like the story just comes, it comes whole enough where that you're curious enough to jump in, you have enough information that you know you can do something with this. And it feels like if you don't say yes to it right now, it's going to leave you and it's going to pick another author, and you are going to be kicking yourself when you read their book.
Well, I know that you didn't write it by the process of osmosis, though. I can tell by the detail that went into this book that you must have done research in libraries and on the ground. Were there any particular places that you were, other than the Lumpkin Trail, obviously that was important to you, that were drawn to you, that helped you during your research?
There was a couple of plantations that I visited. I'm definitely one of those writers where I need to bring all five of my senses in. So I need to feel it, smell it, taste it, touch it. And walking these different plantations, they say if trees could talk, I felt that energy. I always felt like someone was speaking, whispering to me. So being on the various plantations, I visited Booker T. Washington's plantation. There was one in Southern Virginia where the curator was just, I mean, he just knew so much about every single person who lived in the house. And they had an existing slave cabin still on the property that was, that was from the 1800s. And so I was able to walk that and feel it. So I definitely went out of my office to get all this information, but I read a lot. I mean, that's really the best way to find out these people's stories is I've read slave narratives written by enslaved people so that I could get a feel for not only what the textbooks were saying, which definitely is going to have like a film in between
Yeah.
the reader and the subject, but through the eyes of the people who actually went through it. And all of that helped to inform Yellow Wife.
Well, the level of detail you had, for example, the dialect, and you chose the word master and how it was pronounced differently on the plantation just 30 miles from Richmond. How did you even discover that fact?
So when I was reading the different textbooks and narratives, everyone referred to the master of the plantation in different spellings. Sometimes it was ER, sometimes it was RCE, sometimes it was SSA. And so I noticed that when you move in different parts of the country and different parts of the state, the dialect could change. And when I had to get her from Charles City to Richmond, I wanted to make sure that the reader was definitely aware that there was a space, that plantation life was one way and city life was another way. And they spoke differently and they moved differently and they acted differently.
Well, you definitely did that. These books are both discussing the various types of love. We have a love between a man and a woman, the love of a parent for a child, mistaken love, and love of child for parents. Kristen, why did you decide to juxtapose grotesque inhumanity with intimate personal relationships?
Because I think wherever we are, whatever we're facing, we're all human at the end of the day. And I think that in the case of these horrendous things that were happening to people, once they found their way through, or once they found the the tools to physically survive, once they found those first steps out of these horrors that had happened to them, um, their hearts began to open again. And I think that when your heart begins to open again, um, you face the guilt that probably, that shouldn't be there of the people you couldn't save. You face the guilt of the things you haven't done. You face the love of the people you have lost, the love of the people who are still around you, the love of the people who have found their way to you, who you want to protect now. And I think there's such, one of the things that really appeals to me so much about writing historical fiction, particularly historical fiction set in a different place of the world, and centered around characters that might not feel immediately accessible to us, um, is that we all have more in common than we think. And it's that love. It's those very human desires and needs and feelings, the love we have for our children, the love we have for each other, just these the basic emotions. And I think that's such a message to me that runs through all historical fiction. um, and I think that the more that you read about things that are unfamiliar to you, or that are outside your own experience, the more you realize that across the world, across time, across religions, across nationalities, across racial divides, everything, we're all just human. We're all the same. We're all so connected. And I think that's a message that finds its way into my books. And I think it's a message that finds its way into a lot of historical fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have with you, Sadeqa, a little different aspect of this that I wanted to talk about, which was the unfulfilled love and love that was kept a secret. We have mother and child, we have two man and woman involved in a relationship. What are you trying to show by this?
I think love is the heartbeat of everything. I know, particularly in Yellow Wife, the subject is very dark. Slavery is a very dark aspect of our American history. And I knew that I needed to bring some light to this subject. I remember when I was writing maybe the second or third draft, I got stuck because I couldn't move the book forward. And I reached out to one of my mentors and I said, I'm writing this slavery story. And she said, Sadeqa, your book is not about slavery.
Yeah.
She said, slavery is just the backdrop of the story. She said, at the heart of it, it's about love. It's about motherhood. It's about freedom. It's about relationships. She said, if you focus on that, your story will start to move and just have slavery as the backdrop of the story. That's when the story is taking place, but that's not what the story is about.
Yeah.
And that little change in my brain made it easier for me to push through with the story.
Well, it is interesting that both of your female protagonists live in two worlds at the same time. Both Yona and Phoebe. Yona is the child of a German Christian father, but raised by a German woman who had kidnapped her as a young child. And Phoebe is the daughter of a white man and a black woman. This is a question for both of you. So you have to figure out who's going to speak when. Does this duality shape their personal stories? And if so, how?
Sadeqa, you want to answer first?
Sure. I definitely feel like it shapes Phoebe's story. She would not be in the position to be the mistress of the jail if she was not a mulatto woman.
Yeah.
So I think that that definitely tells her story. She most likely would not have been in position to even believe that her father would free her at 18 and that she would go to Massachusetts to go to an all-girls school, because at that time there were no all-girls schools for Black women. And so she was being sent to pass as white. So I think the mixed blood for her definitely informed who she was as she moved through the story. And if she wasn't mulatto, if she wasn't mixed race, it would have been very difficult for me. It wouldn't have been that story. I would have been telling a different story.
Yeah. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. For me, Yona's uh, mixed identity is at the heart of the story too. It would be a very different story if she wasn't questioning these things about herself. As I mentioned earlier, identity is at the heart of this story, and her struggle between, when she finds out that her father was not just a German, but was an ardent follower of Hitler. And here she is, being raised in the woods by a Jewish mystic and choosing to ally herself with a group of Jewish refugees. Those are two diametrically opposed things. And I think she's trying to figure out, how can I be both at once? How can I be both what my blood leads me to be, but then what my decisions lead me to be? And I think that is at the heart of a lot of her struggles, and at the heart of some of the guilt that she carries with her as the story progresses. So yeah, that very much shapes the story.
Well, another part of both of your books that you share is that you talk about those who should not be forgotten, those who did not survive the genocide of World War II, and those who did not survive American enslavement.
Yeah.
But you each treat that topic a little differently. Kristen, for you, the Jews who survived are the ones who carry on the memories of those who did not. What did you mean by that?
I think it's up to all of us who survive to carry on the memories. And I think you know the book is loosely not I shouldn't say loosely based. One of the main areas of research I did for this book was to look into a group called the Bielski Otriad, which was a group of 1,200 Jewish refugees who did survive in the middle of the forest. Almost all of them walked out of the woods alive at the end of the war, and now their descendants number more than 25,000, which is incredible. But the stories they've carried forth are not just the stories of survival, but they're the stories of loss too, because those are the stories, they're all stories that teach us how to move forward. Those loved ones that died because someone came in and murdered them. Like, those are stories we should be remembering so that we don't repeat them, so that we remember that if you let something like that begin to unfold, we all have responsibility in it. You know what I mean? And and so I think that a lot of those people who did walk out of the forest alive felt a deep responsibility to honor those who didn't live. And one of the people I talked to for the research in this story was not only a member of that group, but one of the founding members of that group. He was the youngest and only surviving Bielski brother, and it was called the Bielski Otriad. And when I spoke with him, he said that every morning he wakes up and sees his father in front of him. His father was taken away. So the man I talked to, Aaron, he's 94 now. His father and mother were taken away when he was 14. So that's 80 years ago. And he still has the weight of that with him and feels like his father is still with him. And I think that's true for a lot of people who survived. I think they feel a real responsibility to those who didn't.
Well, you too, Sadeqa, wanted to have your protagonist remember folks that maybe would not live on. And you did it in a different sort of way. You had Phoebe keep a diary, the diary of the fancy girls. Those can read the book and they can know what a fancy girl is. And what did you try to achieve by having her write down? Because who knows if this diary would have even survived? I mean, it's a fiction book, so we'll just assume that it does. But what was her thinking by just writing down? And she used to try to keep little tidbits about each of these women.
It was also because she had an enormous amount of guilt of knowing that the role that she was playing in these women's lives and that she really had no agency over it. She had no choice. In order for her to survive and for her to be there for the people who she cared for, this was a task that she had to endure every day. She had to dress and prepare the fancy girls for sale. And her way of honoring them was recording that they had been there and getting as much information because, as you know, there are no records of sometimes birth records for people who were enslaved. There are no death records. There are no there are no records. And so for her, I mean, Phoebe was one of the only enslaved people who knew her actual birthday because that was something that was kept for them. So to ease her own guilt of having to perform that job, she felt like by recording their information and saying that they had been here was the very least that she could do to honor them.
Well, now we get back to where we started this evening with the statement that you both wanted to address. And so I'm going to repeat what the statement was and then ask each of you to make comment on it. The statement was, why telling stories of the past can help change our perspective on the future. Take it away, ladies.
Sadeqa, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll go. I think for me, I was in conversation with the author of The Prophets, and he said, Sadeqa, do you recognize that the jail in Yellowknife is very similar to mass incarceration in this country of Black and Brown people? And it was not something that I had thought of, but history constantly repeats itself. And one of the things that I tell my children is that in order for us to know where we are going, we need to know from whence we came. We need to understand our American history and what all of that means so that when things play out on the news, there's a reason for it. This is not just something that arbitrarily happens. If we go back into our history, we see the trajectory of what has happened to Black and Brown men and women in this country. And this is why we are here today. And I hope Yellowknife is sort of a book that we could use almost like therapy, right? Like when you open up Pandora's box and you say, this is actually what happened. Why don't we figure this out and deal with it before we just put it back in the box and put it away? Let's uncover it. Let's have the conversation. Let's talk about how we are all very similar, as Kristen said earlier. And if we can have these difficult conversations, we can definitely, as a country, get to the next level of love. And so it's important to understand our history so that we can move forward.
Well said.
I absolutely agree. And I feel the exact same way. And I think we're all telling the same story in different ways because we're telling stories of love and survival against impossible odds. So I think history shows us a way forward in a few ways. I think it shows us the mistakes of the past, which we're not supposed to repeat. But Sadeqa, like you said, the mistakes keep getting repeated, don't they? But I think the more you can not just educate people, but educate people's hearts, which is a different thing than educating their heads, right? Like, I think that's one of the joys of writing fiction is that someone picks up your book to be drawn into the story, but hopefully they walk away with a little bit of perspective on something they didn't know about before or something they didn't know as much as they thought they did about before. I think it's that idea, though, that we can learn from all the human experiences that came before us. And that at the end of the day, so much could be solved just by being decent to each other. You know what I mean? I feel like these are like these little messages that are buried in these lessons of history that are so sweeping and so large and so big and that cost millions and millions of lives that we still haven't entirely learned, right? But at the end of the day, kindness, decency, treating each other as equals. I mean, all of these things that seem so simple to do um, are still just out of our grasp. And I think we need to keep moving in that direction. And I hope that it's books like this that can kind of remind us why we need to do that and what can happen if we don't.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've ended on a very good note, and I want to thank both of you. But this isn't over yet. I think that we have questions in the chat room, and we're going to go with Kristen first, since unfortunately she has to leave us a little bit earlier, Sadeqa, and then we'll follow up with you. So Amanda?
We do have a few questions coming in that are directed to both of you. One in particular to Kristen. Kristen, someone writes, when you write about survival and bravery during World War II, does it ever spark your feelings to make you want to explore your Jewish roots and perhaps embrace it even more?
Certainly. I mean, I think that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Like I said, I grew up Catholic and I grew up not really connected to my dad's side of the family. My parents divorced when I was 11. I went through a period of time where I wasn't really that close to my dad. We're much closer now. We're very close now, but my dad's dad was agnostic, and so he didn't raise him with religion. He raised him with an idea culturally of where he'd come from, but not the religious side of it, which is why my father didn't bring that into his marriage with my mom and why we weren't raised with that. So this is really just a journey I began about half a lifetime ago. I'm 42 now, and it was when I was about 20 that I realized there was this whole missing piece of my family history that I didn't know. I wrote my first World War II book in 2010. It came out in 2012. It was called The Sweetness of Forgetting, and it's about a woman um, who has always thought that her whole family background is Catholic. But then her grandmother has Alzheimer's, and her grandmother's slipping away. And as she is, she starts saying these things that make no sense, that don't connect with what the vision of the past that the protagonist has always had, has always believed. And so she finds herself on very much the same journey that I was on at the time and that I've continued to be on, which is that journey of kind of similarly to what Yona is on in this book. How do the stories the stories that came before us, the stories that we don't know, shape who we are? How does what's in our blood shape who we are? And so yes, I have been exploring that now for 10 years, and I find myself consistently drawn back to it. So the answer to that question is yes. I'm on that journey. I'm still on that journey. And I'm still Catholic. I still consider myself Catholic, but that is a piece of my past I feel very attached to and very compelled to learn more about.
Thank you for that, Kristen. For both authors, we have a few questions. The first is, how do you decide which stories you want to and are going to tell in your books?
Kristen, you go first this time.
That's a great question, and it varies from book to book. I think I usually start with the nugget of an idea, as in, for example, my previous book, The Book of Lost Names. I started with the idea of I'd love to write about French document forgers, because in my two previous novels, I had written about people who escaped using forged documents, and I started to think, where did these documents come from? Who were these forgers? What went into that? So I think I always start with a question that interests me. And then I think I begin to do a little bit of research to make sure that it seems like it's a story that I could and should tell, and that there's enough documentation that I can do, an appropriate amount of research. But then, Sadeqa, I don't know if you feel the same, but I feel like then the challenge becomes, you accumulate so many details and you can't put them all into the book, or it becomes somewhere between like an information dump and just showing off, right? Like, I know this, so I'm going to tell you that I know this, right? So then I think it becomes a matter of narrowing down what fits. And that's months and months of research. It's months of plotting. It's months of thinking, yes, I know this historically, but does this feed the narrative? Does it support the narrative? Does it support the plot? Um, and then sometimes it's finding other stories and other historical details to wrap around it. So again, using the Book of Lost Names as an example, it was a story about document forgers, but I ended up wrapping it in a story of Nazi looted books, books that the Nazis had stolen during World War II, which when I came across that story felt like a very logical fit. So the stories just meshed together and kind of underscored the same things, the same lessons, the same plot points. So I think sometimes if you're in tune with what you're writing and attuned to what you're plotting, um, you have a sense of what fits and what doesn't. What do you think, Sadeqa?
I think all of that, like you covered it beautifully. I second all of that. The only other thing I would add is that I also have to feel it in my gut.
Yep.
Like it has to be that thing that feels like if I don't do it, I'm going to be so sorry. And
Yep.
you know, this is not, I have to do it. And it also has to be those characters are going to bed with me and they're waking up with me.
Yep.
Because even now, I shared with you that it's probably been about 2 weeks since I've been working on my new novel,
Yep.
but the character is still right here. She's
Yep.
sitting on my shoulder. She's like, "What, Sadeqa? I'm waiting to talk to
Yes.
you." And so if I don't feel that I'm ready to talk to you, then that means that that might not be the story for me. And so I think it's all of that, and then just that gut thing that we feel as writers when we're
You
picking the
are
story.
100% right. I totally agree with you. Yep.
Mhm.
Thank you
Oh,
both for that. Maybe we have time for one more, Kristen.
great.
Somebody said, loved both of these books. Do you lead your characters or do they lead you? Is it different at different points in the writing process?
That is a fantastic question. Um, do you want to take that one first,
No,
Sadiqa?
you go first.
Okay. I think the nugget of the idea comes first. The characters develop very naturally on their own as I'm doing the research reading. Because as I'm doing the research, I'm not writing down, I'm not saying this is what this character looks like and this is what she does and this is her background, but it's all happening in my head. And I'm thinking, okay, like I've learned this historical detail. I can see my character doing this because of this, this, and this. Or, you just they start to form and you start to feel them. And kind of like you said a moment ago, Sadiqa, like you feel them in your gut, right? And like you feel them sitting on your shoulder. And by the time I'm outlining, which is a few months after I've begun researching the book, those characters are 90% intact. And I think they develop the rest of the way as I outline. And then I feel them so strongly that by the time I begin writing chapter one, there are things I change in the actual writing of the book because I realize this character wouldn't do this thing that I thought had to happen for the plot to progress. Like they're that real to me at this point. So by the time I'm writing, it is 100% the characters leading me as opposed to me leading the characters. How about you,
Mhm.
Sadiqa?
Yeah, absolutely. I second all of that. And I would say when I'm doing my research and then I do the outline, I also do character bios. And those character bios are usually out the door, make
Yep.
no sense by the time
Yeah.
I start chapter one. They just don't fit because the characters have evolved. I also find that what happens so even when I outline the story, I give some space for the character then to move the way they need to move. And I'm often surprised when I show up and I have one idea of this is what I'm going to accomplish today. And they're like, this is what
Yeah.
we're going to do.
You're
And then I'm like,
right.
well, let me follow you because your way is probably the better way. And sometimes I don't feel like it. Like I don't want to veer left because I was going right.
Yes.
And then I do. And I'm like, yeah, that was so much better than what I had planned. So I definitely feel like we can plan it, we can plot it, but ultimately
Yes.
at the end, the character is driving the story.
Sadiqa, I feel the exact same way, but I feel like every time I say that, I sound like a crazy person because I think that people are like, but you write the characters. Like, I don't understand. Like, how are they leading you? But that's exactly what it feels like. They begin to really feel like real, actual people telling you their story, don't they? And saying, I have to
Absolutely.
do this, I have to do that.
Yeah, 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 I
Crazy.
agree.
Thank you so much for that. I know Kristen, you have another commitment,
I'm
so I
so
know that we
sorry.
have
I
to say
know.
goodbye.
Sadeqa and I were just talking about how jam-packed our schedules are sometimes.
You
I-
guys
I-
are both so busy, and we just appreciate so much on behalf of the library and the Friends of the Library. Of course, everyone attending has had wonderful things to say about you both and the both of your books. Just thank you so much for taking the time. We really do appreciate it.
Oh, I was so grateful to be here. Thank you so much.
And thank you for inviting me to join you, Kristen. That was so super kind.
Sadeqa, I'm already thinking I cannot wait until our next conversation. We're gonna have to do this again. I love talking to you.
Absolutely,
I
absolutely.
want that co-authored book by the two of you collaborating on
Yes,
one book. And your
that-
characters fighting on each other's shoulders.
And Mary, the dedication would be to you because you came up with the idea.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all. I'm sorry to leave a little bit early, but thank you. This was such a pleasure, and thanks to all of you out there. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Amanda, and
You're welcome.
Sadeqa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll
Thank
see you
you.
soon, Kristen.
Sadiqa, I don't know if you have a moment just for another question or two.
I
You
do,
certainly have.
absolutely.
Awesome, thank you. Somebody has asked, would you write a historical fiction novel about a real person?
Well, Yellow Wife was inspired by the true story of Mary Lumpkins. While I couldn't find a lot of details about Mary Lumpkin, I was able to add some fiction to it and learn about women who were like her. So there were a few Yellow Wives who lived in the Richmond area who were all married to jailers. And what I found was that during that time, it was very popular for these men who were in the trading business of slaves to be married or together with a mulatto woman because the act of trading, the profession of trading was looked down upon. So even though everyone had slaves, the actual business was frowned upon. And so these men were the pariahs of society. And so no upper echelon aristocrat type of man would marry his daughter to these men. And so they traditionally would marry women who were very light skinned.
Thank you for that. Somebody else has asked, have you considered writing a conversation guide for young adults to be used in schools along with your book?
Wow, that's an amazing question. No, it never crossed my mind. I think it's a fabulous idea. I actually have been speaking at high schools for the first time, actually, because my first 3 novels were contemporary fiction, love. And so high schools didn't care about me at that point. But when you write something, with some meat and potatoes, a historical fiction, then they come calling. And particularly here in the Virginia area, I've been speaking to high schools and having wonderful conversations with high schoolers. And so that is definitely something that I would consider.
I have a
Thank
quick
you for that.
question.
Yeah. go ahead.
Would you consider doing another historical fiction novel? I think you got it. You understand it. You do it beautifully.
Oh, thank you, Mary. I actually am writing my second historical fiction now. It's called,
good.
yeah, it was just announced a couple of weeks ago. So I guess I can give you guys the title now. It's called Where the Bad Girls Go. And it takes place late 1940s, early 1950s. And I will say that I was inspired to this story because I was remembering my grandmother, my mother's mother. And she and my mother always had this sort of difficult relationship. And I couldn't figure out why. But what I learned was that my grandmother had my mother in 1955, and she had her out of wedlock. So, what a scandal for a girl at 15 to have a baby out of wedlock. And my grandfather's family did not want them to marry because my grandfather was very light skinned and my grandmother's family was very brown. And so they didn't want them to marry. And so my mother tells me that she did not know my grandmother was her actual mother until she was in the 3rd grade because it was such a secret. And that was the beginning of me wanting to understand what it was like for young women in the 40s and the 50s, where, sex was taboo and having a baby out of wedlock and you needed to be married. And what did that look like? And so this new novel explores the themes of motherhood and colorism and classism and socioeconomics. And of course, at the heart of every story I write, there's always love.
You'll be on the high school circuit again with that one. I'm sure.
That's really great. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I feel so privileged to know. I don't see any other questions at the moment coming in. Mary, do you have anything else for
I have
Sadeqa?
one question. It was a minor point, but both you and Kristen talked about your protagonists or their women related to them involving in herbal medicine. And how did that come about? Is there some connection to the story, the idea of, you know, life coming from the herbs, giving help to people? And you both did the same thing. I was amazed by that.
I noticed that too when I was reading The Forest of Vanishing Stars. I thought, oh my gosh, and we even used some of the same herbs. Like
Yeah.
yarrow was in my book, yarrow was in her book. I was definitely inspired. I think that if I had grown up at a different time and a different place, I would have been the medicine woman, because I've always been kind of drawn to herbs and teas and medicines. Now, I can't cure anybody right now, but I think that if I had had more time to study, you know, herbology and that sort of thing, I would have been good at it. And so it was very easy for me to create that for Ruth, which was Phoebe Dolores Brown. It was her mother, and then for her to also pass that on to Phoebe. So that was definitely a natural fit for me. And I also think that when you write stories that take place in the past, modern medicine was not easy to get. So there was always someone who knew how to cure with herbs and teas and things of that nature.
Well, I thought that was fascinating. And the fact that both of you had that theme underscoring your main characters was very interesting. Do we have any more questions, Amanda?
We do not. And Sadeqa, I know you also have a commitment. You're both so busy. So we just want to say thank you for joining
Thank
us. It was
you.
really great to have the both of you together.
Wonderful. Very
Yeah.
good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. You can stay for our big drawing if you want. You're not going to be a winner, let me tell
Oh
you.
my gosh. Well, good luck to the winter. And thank you so much to the Friends of the Library for putting on such a fabulous event. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.
You
Thank
as
you.
well,
You too.
Sadeqa. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye.